Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ted Jackson with the Disability Organizing Network at California Foundation for Independent Living Centers. The Disability Organizing Network is a network of approximately 30 disability community advocates and community organizers at the independent living centers across the state of California. And we have 1,500 volunteers that work on advocacy to improve access in all aspects of life for people with disabilities. We like to say that we organize for accessible communities wherever people with disabilities live, work, learn, shop, play, and vote. And with that, we're gonna get started shortly, but I wanna hand it off to Zach Baldwin from the American Association of People with Disabilities and the REV Up Campaign.
Great, thanks so much, Ted. Hi everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. And today's webinar is brought to you by the Disability Organizing Network and the REV Up Campaign. The REV Up Campaign was launched by the American Association of People with Disabilities in 2016. It's a nonpartisan initiative that coordinates with national, state, and local disability organizations to increase the political power of the disability community while also engaging candidates and the media on disability issues. The campaign focuses on voter registration, education, access, and engagement, and REV UP stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. This is the first of a series of webinars focused on access barriers to the voting process. Our next webinar will be coming up towards the end of September, and will focus on barriers to voter education materials offered by election officials as well as campaigns. So stay tuned for more information on that. Today we've got a great lineup of speakers, including Veda Flores with the League of Women Voters, Kathleen Unger with VoteRiders, and Paul Spencer with the Disability Rights California. And we'll have time for questions towards the end. So for now, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Veda. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Veda Flores, and I'm pleased to be here today. I'm a lifelong volunteer of the League of Women Voters of the Bay Area as Communications Director. My day job is with the Marin County Elections Department, where I work as Communication Outreach Consultant serving underserved communities, those alternately abled, and youth voters. I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar and thank Ted Jackson, the DO Network, and the team at REV UP. Next slide, please. I want to thank everyone for their hard work during the National Disability Voter Registration Week in July. Here in my county, Marin County, California, we held 7 different events registering over 30 people. So I just want to tell everybody it's not the number of people that we registered to vote, but it's the number of people that we engaged. And we engaged over 250 people, bringing forward the conversation that every voice counts, and it's important for everyone to participate in the process, whether you're just reading the paper or talking to other people or going to city council meetings, you're engaging in the process. And today we'll discuss doing your homework, you know, where to go and what to do, where's the best location. Is it better to have a traditional tabling event, or would it be better to create packets and give packets away to individuals and challenging them to register 5 people? Creating partnerships is excellent. The League of Women Voters is available in every single state in the US, with several different local leagues that are trained to work with you and help you in your voter registration drives. We want to give people choices, and the best way to do that is reaching out peer-to-peer. So peer-to-peer contact, inviting some youths. If you're going to a college, inviting youths. If you're going to other location, make sure to have someone that looks like the people who will most likely be at that location. And we want to make sure that you know what you can offer. Train your volunteers and remind them that election laws have changed across the United States, and there are great opportunities for you to expand your outreach. Today we'll talk about tricks of the trade, what to say to engage people, how to engage new voters and those who are not yet citizens. And finally, we want to have the opportunity to offer you suggestions for the new voter, where to get information, how to find a ride, is voting by mail the best choice for you, and what to do afterwards. Do you bring a sign-up sheet with you to engage them in your organization? Or do you just let them drop? And I know that the REV Up community is all about registering, educating, and voting. So we want to usher people through the process of voter registration up to voting. Next slide, please. Firstly, we want you to do your homework. Consider the traditional tabling experience where you set up a table outside a high traffic area, or do you want to create the packets like I mentioned before? And creating packets, you can really challenge people like the bucket challenge. Challenge them to register 5 people before National Voter Registration Day on September the 25th. Challenging an individual who's already registered to vote really engages them and involves them a little bit more in the process. We want you to consider the best location. And is this in a student center or outside a local grocery store? When is the best time to get the biggest bang for your buck? Before work, when people are in a rush? That could be a great time to hand out individual voter registration forms. They're perforated and folded for you to pop into the mail, and in California, no postage is necessary. So it's great to hand to people who are on their way to work. Or is it better to engage people at lunchtime when they have a little bit more time to talk to you? And you want to be clear with your volunteers. You'll need 2 or 3 people at your table if you choose to do a tabling event. And we want enough people at the table so we can have a one-on-one dialogue and have a meaningful conversation. But we want to remind your volunteers not to sit behind the table, but to stand out in front and engage people. And sometimes if we have too many volunteers, they get bored standing around. And you should realize, is it better to use hard paper voter registration forms, or should I bring my computer and register people online like we can do here in California? If you bring your computer, be sure to have a strong internet signal and be aware that you may not be able to see the screen in sunny locations. And just remember, should I decorate the table and with brightly colored banners, have your voter registration folders and have giveaways? Or should I keep the table simple and clean and really eye-catching? So I've had voter registration events where I've had too much literature on the table, and you really don't need a lot of literature, just 1 or 2 pieces to give a good idea of the voting process, what are the requirements, and where they can find more information. Next slide, please. On this slide, I have a big blue swirl that reminds us to stay engaged, and it says Great Expectation on the top. Again, be clear of your goals. Sometimes volunteers don't understand that it's not just about sitting behind the table or handing out literature. We want to make sure that our volunteers will excite the community about civic engagement, reminding them to read the paper, sign your sheet, pick up literature about you, or potentially donate money to help the cause. Be sure to have a handout about your group or organization. Next slide, please. And be clear that of your goal, do you want to register 5 people or 50 people? If you want to register 50 people, that means that you need to talk to at least 500, because sometimes you need to talk to 10 people in order to get one person to register to vote. Create partnerships with organizations like the League of Women Voters. At every location across the country, every local league has a voter registration team. And to find out where your local League of Women Voters is, you can always go to lwv.org. And there's a Get Involved tab for you to click on, and it shows you where your local League of Women Voters is located. You can also do a Google search and find their telephone number directly. And as you go and think about registering voters, you have to realize, what do I have to offer the voter? And you have to be confident that just being there and being out in the public shows the public that you care about community, civic engagement, voting, and participating. So you offer a lot just by being there at the table. And any information, the details, the minute details, can be learned very easily. You can call your elections department and you can Google whatever county you're in. I'm in Marin County, so I Google Marin County Elections Department, and the telephone number and information about their website pops right up. You can also talk to the League of Women Voters again, or other organizations like the YWCA. They have advocacy groups that can help you. So create those partnerships and don't try and reinvent the wheel, because there are strong voices that are already out there. Remember to choose wisely, and remember that you offer a lot just by being there. Okay, next slide, please. In California, we've really had a lot of great changes to the elections process. Here in California, we don't need a stamp to mail in our vote by mail ballot. Our vote by mail ballots can be postmarked on election day, November the 6th, but don't have to be into the elections department until 3 days afterwards. That's new legislation that allows the post office 3 more days to handle the mail. And you also, and the last day to register by paper ballot is October the 22nd. In California, we have same-day voter registration, and this is done at the elections department. You can go into your elections department in California on elections day, register to vote, and vote at the same time. So it's really a great opportunity for us to take advantage of these new rules. At this time, we have the opportunity to vote by mail or vote at the traditional polling place. That's the location where you would go to cast your ballot. Voting by mail ballots in California are mailed 30 days before the election. It gives you more time to review each ballot measure, review the candidates, and spend a little bit more time. You can mail your ballot with no postage, as I mentioned before, or you can walk it into the polling place if you want the traditional voting experience. You also have the opportunity to vote at the polling place. So that's where you would sign the roll book and use the traditional machines, or you could use, in my county, they have sit puff machines if you have dexterity issues. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit more about tricks of the trade at your voter registration event. We talked about making your table eye-catching. We want everyone who's participating to smile and make eye contact with people and stand in front of the table asking people, engaging them as they pass by with the question, are you registered to vote? Or asking them, do you know where your polling place is? They might answer, I'm not yet registered. And you can say, this is a great time for you to register to vote. It only takes 2 minutes. This is a great time for you to register to vote. It only takes 2 minutes. Many people are already engaged in the voting process, and sometimes I like to make brownies and slice them into 1-inch cubes. And if they're already registered to vote, I say, well, you get brownie points for already being registered to vote. So I'll hand them a brownie. That is, if they're not gluten-free. And there's another category of passersby that we often see, and those people are non-citizens. And we don't want to turn people off with a citizenship question. And I often say, when people start to shy away, I say, it's okay if you can't register to vote today, because it's important for you to participate because you're an influencer. And sometimes it's more important to be an influencer because you can talk to your friends and family and influence those around you to participate in the voting process. Many people who are non-citizens shy away and feel embarrassed. So this is a way that we can uplift them and include them in the process. We also have new legislation in California where we can pre-register voters who are 16 and 17 years old. That we use the same paper form, but there's a new checkbox on the California voter registration form that says, are you 16 or 17 years old? And this is a great opportunity for the Secretary of State to put their name in the roll and send them literature throughout the year. In California, we have 2 months that are dedicated to the youth voter. In April, many high schools have mock elections. And in September, the Secretary of State will send out an email about voter registration day. So we want to engage these youths, anyone in high school or 16 or 17 years old, the importance of voting. So get them on our team before the voting process begins. Next slide, please. And we also have to offer, we also have to know what else is there to offer the voter. The League of Women Voters puts out something called the Easy Voter Guide. It's a shortcut, researched information that's where they've done the work for you. They give you pros and cons of ballot measures and propositions. They don't give recommendations for candidates, only ballot measures and state propositions. So this is a great resource for you. That's the Easy Voter Guide. The website called votersedge.org is a place to find information about candidates. And it's not information that the League of Women Voters provides. It's a free spot for each candidate to upload their photograph, their top 3 priorities, contact information, and if they want to take the time, they can even go deeper and talk about their philosophy and their workflow plan being if they were elected in the job. Many states have audio CDs available with the ballot measures and propositions audio taped for you to listen to, and you can find those at this telephone number listed, 800-345-VOTE, 800-345-8683. You can also go to the Secretary of State's website and download an audio MP3 file of the propositions. Your elections department also offers large print voter guides and large print voter information for those who have a difficulty seeing, like me. You can also call your elections department and let them know that you're coming to the polling place. Many election departments throughout the county of California have curbside voting, so you don't even have to get out of your car. Sometimes you can call the elections department and they'll come to your home, they'll come to senior citizens' retirement home and help them vote on elections day. So you have to do a little homework and call your elections department and ask for what they offer. And did you know that you can find your polling place if you go to elections, MarinCountyElections.org, or type in the name of your county, elections.org, and you can find their telephone number and lists of polling places. And just by putting in some simple information in what they call a VIP, very important persons voter portal, you can put in your street address and find your polling place. Many locations offer transportation to polling places, time off of work, and other opportunities for you to engage the voter. And this slide, this information here, this is what you have to offer the voter. So not only are you registering them to vote, you're educating them with the website Voter's Edge, and you are also giving them the opportunity to get to the polling place. And I'd like to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. And I have other information to provide, and I will forward details and information to Ted. And I'm wondering if you have any questions, feel free to ask me when question time begins.
Thank you very much, Vita. We really appreciate you sharing from your experience. For those of you around the country, at the Do Network, we've worked with Vita for a long time, and she does an amazing job in Marin County of registering voters, both in her role as an outreach person, the Marin County Registrar of Voters, but also with the League of Women Voters. And every time I'm in Marin County, no matter what kind of festival I'm at, I always run into Vita, who is either working on a political issue or registering voters. So thank you very, very much. So I want to move us along and connect us to Kathleen Unger from VoteRiders. And I'm going to switch presentations here. So Kathleen, thank you very much for joining us today. I've unmuted your line. Can you hear us?
Okay. Hi. So yes, we ran into some technical difficulties. I sure hope that you all can hear me through what we put together here. So thank you so much to you, Ted, and to Zach and your colleagues at American Association of People with Disabilities for hosting this dialogue. Just nothing of all you do to enhance and protect the right to vote of Americans with disabilities. We at VoteRiders look forward to learning how we can better help you and your constituents. Next slide, please. So VoteRiders is a 501c3 national non-partisan organization that I founded in early 2012. And I knew from the 2010 elections
Kathleen?
that there would be a tsunami of voter ID laws, and I knew the existing terrific organizations handle litigation and advocacy, but not direct assistance to voters. So our mission is to ensure that all citizens are able to exercise their right to vote, and we do so with a laser-like focus on voter ID. In essence, our mission is to ensure voters have an acceptable ID required in their state, and the confidence that they do, or the confidence that none is required because their state, like California, doesn't have a voter ID law. VoteRiders informs and helps citizens to secure their voter ID, support organizations like AAPD and communities to sustain voter ID education and assistance efforts. We concentrate especially on helping voters obtain the documents required by state's voter ID law. Next slide, please. So 11% of voting U.S. citizens lack a current government issued photo ID means that over 25 million voters nationally do not have the only types of ID that are common to all state voter ID laws, the voter's state driver's license or state ID. So think about that, 25 million Americans without by far the most common type of voter ID. At this point, there are voter ID laws in 34 states. 10 of those states have strict voter ID laws, meaning voters' ballots will count only if they show a required ID during early voting if allowed in the state, or at the polls, or within a specified short period of time after election day. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to those 25 million without a likely voter ID, VoteRiders on-the-ground experience, which has been corroborated by reputable university studies in Texas and Wisconsin, shows that many, many millions more citizens are so confused and intimidated by complicated and stringent voter ID laws that they won't vote even though they have the requisite ID. Indeed, there's massive confusion about what documents are needed to register in addition to what ID is needed to vote. Many people have the necessary ID but don't know it. Many others believe they need ID in their state but do not. Importantly, not only are voters confused, but poll workers in every state are confused. More fundamentally, many, if not most people, do not understand that voter ID is different from and in addition to voter registration. They hear the words voter ID, but they're thinking voter registration. And I guarantee you all that if you dig deeply enough among the people you know, you're going to find that very confusion. So bottom line, it's not enough to register to vote in many states with voter ID laws. So, and while we work with organizations and voters nationwide, we focus especially on voter ID states with highly competitive House, Senate, and gubernatorial races. So what if you live in a state without a voter ID law, again, like California? Well, why should you care? Well, because if there's an issue that you really care about, it really does matter that those who agree with you can vote regardless of where they live. Next slide, please. So who's impacted by these voter ID laws, which includes, again, many, many millions more who are just plain confused and won't vote. The photos on this slide show some of the voters whom VoteRiders has helped to get their voter ID. These laws disproportionately impact a broad proportion of the population who are more likely to be without a current driver's license in their state. And as you all well know, many voters with disabilities are unable to drive. In 2012, Doug Cruz of Rutgers University conducted a study based on the Pew Foundation's survey of performance of American elections, and found that voters with disabilities were over 1.5 times more likely than the population as a whole to lack ID. Other groups of at-risk voters include older adults who are no longer driving if they ever did, or they have mobility issues, young adults, including students who attend schools in another state, voters of color, voters with low income who cannot afford the time and money to obtain a voter ID, and women, because over 80% of women change their names upon marriage, and a number of states have laws where there's supposed to be an exact match between the name on your ID and the name in which you're registered to vote. Next slide, please. This shows a map with different colors that indicate which states have strict
versus non-strict voter ID laws, and those that do not have voter ID laws at all. Next slide, please. So VoteRiders, we at VoteRiders, we identify the at-risk voters through our voter ID coalition coordinators in Arizona, Florida, and Wisconsin. Through our website, through our toll-free helpline, through texting, email, social media, all kinds of events, and hundreds of partner organizations. We have partner organizations in at least 17 states. Some of them, in turn, are coalitions of organizations. And these organizations serve or otherwise interface with the kinds of vote, especially the kinds of voters whom I enumerated, who are at risk, including, of course, the community of those who have a disability. We are also, and from my perspective, most excitingly, we have entered into partnerships with organizations that engage in voter registration drives and issue advocacy, who do that one-to-one canvassing or phone banking or text banking, sometimes tabling, because these are the organizations that are out there having that one-to-one contact with the voter, and there are only two organizations' efforts so far who have added a voter ID question to their script, their outreach script, when they're canvassing, say, or phone banking, and that question, from our perspective, is always best if it's just very simply, do you have a current driver's license in your state? Because there's no confusing, whether you do or you don't, or if you don't know, that's fine. But by asking people, do you have a voter ID? The fact is, again, people don't really know what is allowed or required for a voter ID or a photo ID. And so that kind of question just can lead to further confusion. So we're working with the 501c3 table in Wisconsin, Wisconsin Voices. They have a recently released voter app and have added this voter ID question to it. And then those who respond either no or basically anything with anything other than a resounding yes, those voter files are made accessible to VoteRiders, and we follow up to make sure that people are confident that they have the right ID and to provide soup to nuts assistance to them if they need help to obtain their ID. We're also working with an effort based in Virginia that's expanding up to 16 states, a virtual phone banking effort. And again, it's the same kind of operation. So we are very interested in entering into what we call these direct voter contact partnerships, so that we can help with the voter ID while all these other organizations are out there basically in a position to identify who needs help. So next slide, please. This shows both the English and Spanish language versions of our Texas voter ID information card. Both groups, types of partnerships that I just mentioned, the coalitions, the voter ID coalitions, and the direct voter contact partnerships, they and well, frankly, thousands of others are distributing VoteRiders freely downloadable cards that we have created. They're literally the size of a business card for all 50 states and DC, both in English and in Spanish. And they are unique. They are because they are clear and they are precisely accurate. And they are especially helpful when someone is in the polling place and dealing with a misinformed poll worker, to give them both, you know, something substantively, here are the highlights of what's required, I have this, or, you know, it gives them confidence. And they also actually have an impact on turnout. One of our hundreds of partners, Mi Familia Vota Texas, for the November 2016 election, handed out our cards, again, both in English and in Spanish, to the, while they were canvassing the 6 precincts, majority Latino precincts in Houston, Harris County. After the November 2016 election, Harris County's clerk reported that turnout countywide had decreased 1% from the prior presidential election in 2012. However, in those 6 precincts where our cards had been distributed, turnout increased cumulatively 92%, almost 9% per precinct. So this kind of a confidence builder, as you can see, makes a big, big difference. And we provide these cards for free to 501c3 organizations. When you go to our website, in the toolbar, it says Get Involved, and then you can click on a form where you can order the cards, and we you know, have them printed and shipped off, which we've done with over 1 million of the cards so far. Next slide, please. This slide shows a photo of a then homeless veteran with whom we worked intensively for 6 months to obtain a DMV approved birth certificate, so that Mr. Hatton could in turn obtain his voter photo ID and vote, which he was finally able to do. So VoteRiders will cover the cost of the underlying documents in order to get the, quote, free voter ID. You know, you're talking about a certified copy of the birth certificate, of any name change document, you know, again, the marriage certificate, all the various ways that people's names have changed over time, Social Security card, trying to get that, and we arrange for transportation to government ID issuing offices. We will have somebody accompany someone to those offices if they like, and we work with an army of pro bono lawyers all over the country. So that's the kind of assistance that we give. Next slide, please. So what can you do? You could volunteer. Again, on our website in the toolbar, Get Involved. If you click on that, you'll find a volunteer questionnaire. Also, we'd love for you to sign up at our website. Scrolling down to the bottom of the home page is just an little area where you can sign up. So as you can see, voter ID has a sizable impact on the right to vote and on elections altogether. Please know how much we anticipate learning what voter ID related issues you might bring to our attention, and how VoteRiders might be more effectively of assistance to the disability community. Next slide, please. we welcome your questions and ideas at voteriders.org or info@voteriders.org, or by calling or texting our toll-free helpline 844-338-8743. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. And now we're going to move along to Paul Spencer from Disability Rights California.
So thanks for having me. My name is Paul Spencer. I'm a staff attorney with Disability Rights California. We're the protection advocacy system for California. I think a lot of you are familiar with our work, but I'm part of the Voting Rights Practice Group. And we work to make sure that voting is accessible for people with disabilities in California. So next slide, please. My first slide is, what does junk mail have to do with overcoming barriers to voter registration? This is just something I always like to ask people about. Do you get junk mail, when you're leading up to campaigns? I know that people find it annoying. I do too. But if you get that junk mail, it's a good sign. It means you're a registered voter. You're part of the political process. Candidates want your vote. So you're getting that junk mail. You're getting phone calls. You're getting people knocking on your door. I think that's a good thing. So one problem, though, is if you've never been registered to vote, is you're out of that cycle. Like politicians don't know you exist, and they don't want your vote. So in some ways, if you're not a registered voter, it's harder to get into the cycle of civic engagement. So I always like to joke that, you really shouldn't think about that mail is just going to start piling up here probably within 2 weeks and just dump on us all through the first week of November. It's a good sign, just part of civic engagement. So let's move on to the next slide. So, here maybe some good news is as far as, people that self-report with disabilities versus the population without disabilities, the voter registration statistics are somewhat comparable. So this is from an article from the Pew Research Center. It's a political profile of disabled Americans. It's a great article, and it really kind of runs through some of the details and gets into the nitty-gritty of who's registered and who's not, and kind of lets you brainstorm your strategy. But I think it's interesting that, we're not, this isn't doom and gloom here. Like, the voter registrations are somewhat comparable. I mean, so this is kind of where we're starting with the somewhat good news. But so if we go into the next slide, this is kind of the bad news, is that, registered voters with disabilities are less likely to vote than people without disabilities. So also, if you look at this too, right now where we are, a lot of studies show about 1 in 5 Americans have a disability. So even if it is around 80%, still it's a lot of people with disabilities that are not registered to vote. So, we need to think about how to overcome barriers to get people to increase the voter registration. So let's go to the next slide, just kind of getting into overcoming barriers. So, one issue there is that, registered voters with disabilities are more likely to report that it was too difficult to vote. I'm sure a lot of you might see that in your work. You experience those barriers talking to people, especially, it's just trying to get a ride on election day. I mean, things are difficult. But, kind of those same lessons also apply to people with disabilities that aren't registered to vote. A lot of it are perceived roadblocks or, reasons why they think they shouldn't be registered to vote because they can't vote for X reason. So one thing my colleagues and I do in our work is we try to empower people with ways to navigate past these perceived roadblocks. And I think also empowering people with this knowledge is good to get registered voters with disabilities also out to the polls. So let's go to the next slide. So it's get past the roadblocks. And, and I underline 3 things here. It's teach, explain, and empower. So, always, when you're kind of approaching voter registration, you really need to talk about, you need to address people's concerns. I think one thing that's really helpful is just to kind of start with the basics. There are really good federal and state laws that guarantee the ability for people with disabilities to vote privately and independently. So one way that is that, polling places have to be accessible. That's a big one. And I think you'd often be surprised when people are really unsure whether or not their polling location is going to be accessible. Yes, there is a little bit of wiggle room, and sometimes, I shouldn't say occasionally, but not all polling locations are accessible, but generally they are. California's kind of doing okay. Other states have more problems with physical polling place accessibility. But that's one issue, and then it can be helpful to help voters, especially, let's say whether or not they're going to know that their polling place is accessible. And there's ways to look that up and find out. So that can be a way to empower people. Also, this one is every polling location has an accessible voting system. Every polling location in the country, you're required to have an accessible voting system. But we often run into voters that are unsure if there's going to be one there or not. So I think that knowledge is really helpful in just kind of going over what these accessibility requirements are that guarantee the right to vote privately and independently can get people more engaged and maybe more willing to register to vote. So the next step is, great, you're registered to vote, but and I often hear this barrier from people is that I'm not going to register to vote or bother because I really just can't get the materials in a way I can access them. So, you need to explain how to get accessible materials. So on one hand, there's how to get materials that are accessible. On the other hand is how to get materials that are easy to understand and navigate. And, I love the League of Women Voters materials they put out. They put out the Easy Voter Guide. That's my favorite. So I'm also not just focused on getting materials in accessible format, but also getting materials in a way that you can realistically get through. Sometimes in California, we have a massive number of ballot propositions. So finding ways to effectively navigate that information and also reminding people what, just sort of the basic election rules are that, yes, you can bring written materials into the polling location with you. You can bring a cheat sheet. I bring a cheat sheet. But sometimes these more basic stuff that you might forget about sort of gets lost in the conversation, but I think it's always useful to remind people what these rules are. There are other rules, like you can bring someone into the polling booth to help you fill out the application if you wanted to. Fill out the ballot. Ideally, you'd be using an accessible voting system, but these options are there, and depending on the voter, they can be really helpful. And the last one here is, I think, kind of the hardest, and that's sort of getting over the voter apathy about voting, like my vote's not going to matter. So I think that's the tough one to get past, and I think that just really helps to kind of talk it through. And, I always like to tell stories about, if you're a person with a disability, oftentimes, the decisions of your local politicians really matter, and your state politicians, and those local races are where your vote is more likely to really have an impact. So kind of talking through that stuff, I think, really helps. So again, it's teaching about what the rules are, explaining how to get the accessible materials, and then kind of getting past that voter apathy by empowering people to vote. So let's go to the next slide. We just talked about roadblocks, and now I want to talk about opportunities for registration and increasing these opportunities. So the other panels, have touched on, some other ways that you register to vote, like you would, let's go really old school, you would fill out a voter registration card at the library. Or you can register to vote online in those states. But there's some other tools we have in our tool chest as disability rights advocates. And so let's just talk about the National Voter Registration Act. So this federal law requires public assistance offices and state-funded offices that primarily serve people with disabilities to offer voter registration opportunities. So what that means is, if let's say you are a client of a regional center, when you apply or when you renew, you're going to be offered an opportunity to register to vote. This is a wonderful protection for people with disabilities, and part of the reason Congress did it is because the idea that people with disabilities are less likely to go to the DMV. So just offering voter registration opportunities at the DMV isn't enough. So these options for public assistance and state-funded offices that primarily serve people with disabilities, which I know is a mouthful, but a lot of you on the call work for an organization that is required to offer voter registration opportunities. So I think it's always useful in your own organization to make sure that your NVRA coordinator that you're supposed to have is following the rules. But when I'm talking to people from other organizations or other agencies, I always try to bring it up and see if it's something that is on the mind of the frontline employees, if people are aware of what the rules are, and kind of make sure the process is working. And it should also be coordinated. In California anyway, the county election officials are helping coordinate those voter registration cards and how it comes. And in California, we're having some luck getting some additional agencies designated. But this is an important protection for people with disabilities, but really it matters if, we as advocates are staying on top of it and making sure that the compliance is actually happening. So, the next one though, and this is part of the NVRA, and this is traditionally what most people think of when they're thinking NVRA is, voter registration opportunities at the DMV. So what's different though is, 7 states so far are now doing automatic DMV voter registration. I put automatic in quotation marks because it's not exactly automatic. It depends state to state. Oregon's relatively automatic, like you're automatically getting registered to vote. Whereas in California, you're defaulted into registering to vote if you're otherwise eligible, and you have to affirmatively opt out. So, you know, for example, the box comes checked, I want to register to vote, and you have to actually go to make the affirmative effort to say, I don't want to register to vote. This is better because human nature is we're less likely to opt out. So this is a good practice for getting people registered. So there's 7 states that have done it. Just for example, you know, California rolled our new system out in April, and they've released numbers for April and May, and the increase in registrations is tenfold than what they would normally get in the month. So it went from about 25,000 to 250,000. They're still working out the data, but you know, this trend over the years is really going to increase the amount of people registered to vote, and it's definitely going to capture people with disabilities and also increase the general voter registration rates. It's also useful, you know, especially if you're in California. We worked really hard to get the DMV to put an accessible computer in all of the DMV field offices. And if you're in another state where you're curious about doing this as well, you know, talk to me afterwards. But we think this is a big win. So in every field office, there's an accessible computer now, which has AT features that should allow you to fill out the forms privately and independently, but also importantly, when you're filling out that voter registration question, you can do that privately and independently. So, you know, in the past, if you were filling out the paper forms to the DMV, you would have had to disclose your political party. So, I mean, it's kind of bringing that private and independent concept, not just to voting itself, but also registering to vote in more of the process. And regardless, you know, it is nice at the DMV to have this accessible option, which they didn't have in the past. So if you're curious about that, or you're working in another state and you want to talk to me afterwards, please contact me. I love chatting about it. But the takeaway here is, I think we're going to see an increase in voter registration numbers in general in these 7 states, especially California, you know, where 1 in 5 Americans live. So it's going to increase the overall voter registration rates, which, as I was talking about in the beginning, is a good thing because it gets people involved in the system. It gets you getting that junk mail calls, and it gets you into the system. So it's great. So let's move on to the last slide I have, which is kind of the most complicated. But, you know, this is definitely a barrier to voter registration, and it's so, you know, in California we call it conservatorship of the person, but in other states, you know, it's guardianship over an adult. And you know, it's basically, the court will designate someone to, you know, oversee the personal and medical affairs of another person. So you know, in California we call it the person that's in charge of the personal financial decision is the conservator, and then the person that needs that help is the conservatee. So, you know, here's the important things about this, is that it's the judge's determination about whether or not that person is mentally incompetent. So that's an unfortunate term, but, you know, it's the term of art, and it varies state to state, but generally if you are mentally incompetent, you're not capable of voting. So let's talk about some good stuff there, is that it's the judge making this determination. It's not the conservator. So that's important to remember. And, you know, especially if you look at someone's probate paperwork and that box isn't checked that the person's mentally incompetent, that means they can vote. And it's really not the conservator's decision, it's the person themselves that is conserved that gets to make the decision about whether or not they want to vote. So let's kind of talk about the standard a little bit. And this varies state to state. If you are curious to, actually, it's also, the Pew Research Center has another really good article out, you know, comparing the state to state about what the conservatorship guardianship process looks like in each state. But so in California, Maryland, Nevada, and New Mexico, we have a standard that the ABA thinks is pretty good. And basically that is, so before a court is going to remove the right to vote, they have to find by clear and convincing evidence that a person cannot communicate with or without reasonable accommodations their desire to participate in the voting process. So this basically means, you know, if you're able to communicate that you want to vote, you're not going to lose the right to vote, which is a pretty voter-friendly standard. So we like that, and that's why it's a best practice. And this is new in California. It's only been in effect for about 2 years. So, you know, especially if you are an advocate in California, you know, if someone was conserved a long time ago, they might have been conserved under a different standard, and they might want to get the right to vote back. So one way you can get that right to vote back, you know, in California, it's pretty easy. I mean, if you show the court that you have a desire to vote, you know, you've met that standard. And Disability Rights California, for Californians with disabilities that are conserved, we've made a toolkit that has a sample letter. You know, depending on the state you're in, your protection advocacy system might have something similar. But in California, it's relatively simple. You don't technically even need a lawyer to get the right to vote back. You just need to show the judge that you have the desire to vote. And if you think about it, if you write a letter to your judge that you want to vote, you've more or less met the standard in California that you can communicate a desire to vote. So that's how you would get it reinstated. But it's just something in your advocacy work, because this is a potential barrier, and we hear it a lot too, especially from parents that are conservatory about whether or not their adult child can vote. And really it is the court's decision about whether or not that person has the ability to vote and should keep the right to vote. So, I think it's an easy way to go back to is that it's the judge's determination, and also just be available to kind of help people talk through how to get the right to vote back if they're curious. So those are all the slides I had. So I think it's time to turn it back over to questions now. And I appreciate you all tuning in.
All right, thank you very much, Paul. We're going to open the floor to questions.
Ed, this is Zach. I see a question popped up from Nancy Wilson, just asking for Paul's contact information.
I'm happy to. It's I can email around afterwards, but it's paul.spencer@disabilityrightsca.org.
I'd like to share a good email address for me, and that would be marinelections360@gmail.com.
And again, for Kathleen Unger at VoteRiders, the best would be info@VoteRiders, VoteRiders.org.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for bearing with our technical issues today. This is our first webinar on the Zoom platform.